Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video review series where I take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. For this video, I'll be reviewing the trilogy of solo adventures Shipwrecked, designed by Blaze Wigglesworth for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my videos, consider using my affiliate links for your online shopping and supporting me via patreon.com/RogueWatson. Shoutouts to Platinum patrons Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Manuel, Basil, Huskar124, Wizard Princess, my favorite D&D player Christopher, Dave, and By Inspection. And gold patrons RPG Papercrafts, Charming Grenade, Pretty Boy Yuma, Marcos Ted Vicente, Gilberto, Shane AK, Cert2B, Adam, Dead Lizard Lounge, Sam, Arash, Lumpy Spuds, Jerome, Fatboy619, Sklenia, and Nick. Thank you all very much for your support. So, Shipwrecked, when I say solo adventure, you probably think it is for a DM and a player, a one-person party, which I have reviewed adventures like that, as recently as the Blood Hunter, I believe, was designed that way. That's not what this is. This is a solo adventure, no DM required. Literally just one player reads this and has an adventure. And it's a cool idea, and it's something that reminds me of the Choose Your Own Adventure and Fighting Fantasy series that I used to read back in the day. So, back when I grew up, the internet was in its infancy. We had video games, but they were 8-bit, and we would go to the local library, which is a place where you could check out books. It was the Blockbuster of books. Now, Blockbuster, what now? And a lot of the books that I really liked, because I was a nerd who was into fantasy stuff, were the Choose Your Own Adventure series and the Fighting Fantasy series. And what these did is they allowed you to make choices on they were, I think, usually written in second persons, like you do this, you do that, and you could make choices on the end of every page. It would be like, if you want to do this, let's say there's a charging rhinoceros coming at you. Do you jump down the sewer grate? Do you climb up the wall, or do you just stand there and take it? And then you would go to page 37, go to page 15 or something, and make that choice. And then it would continue on, and it would just create these branching paths, and it was really clever. And as a kid, I just thought that was the coolest thing ever. And there were usually like big, sci-fi things, or some kind of, Indiana Jones style tomb raiding thing or something, and just a lot of fun. I went through a lot of those books, and that's kind of how this is constructed. Except instead of really making choices, you're making skill checks because it's D&D. And that is satisfying in some ways. It does have a major caveat in that instead of creating all these interesting branching paths, it's a very linear adventure. It's very linear. And, the designer crafted these really great battle maps and scenarios. And as a game designer, I know that you want your players to do the thing that you're making. It can be very hard to make something that they may just skip entirely, but that's kind of what D&D, is. That's part of what you do as a DM, is you prep stuff, and you might not even end up using it, because ultimately your players are in control of a lot of that. Hopefully they should be. In this case, the way this kind of has to work is it has to be very, very linear. You're following an exact set of, like, a path in front of you. It's still very adventure-based, but you're going into a building, or going down the trap door, you're going down the tunnel. Instead of making all these choices, instead you're prompted to make skill checks. Okay, now make a perception check to see if you notice this trap, or now make an investigation check to see if you notice this clue, or notice a monster coming at you or something. So you lose some of that because you're not making these branching choices, but you do gain the ability to play a adventure by yourself. Now, because this is a solo adventure with no DM, it means if I do my usual beat-by-beat critical analysis, you would not really be able to play this adventure, or at least you would have this adventure spoiled for you, because that's how it's designed to be played. You have to read it and then do the things and it says on the in the page. I want to show you the first 2 or 3 pages so you get an example of it as if you were clicking on the free preview or something. But I'm purposely not going to show you this whole product, and I'm not going to dig into what all you're going to be doing in addition to the entire trilogy, because I don't want to spoil that for you, because that would literally, that is the adventure, is just reading it firsthand. Normally I can say this is for, obviously for DMs, we're going to talk about it, and then it'll be for your players, but we are the players here. There is no DM, which is a really fascinating way of doing this. The big advantage here is that the production values are incredibly good. Despite this being a very relatively inexpensive product, each trilogy is very inexpensive. It's divided up into these 3 adventures, mini adventures. They're all about 20 pages long, but the things they include are things that way bigger, pricier adventures do not include. So, for example, full color grid battle maps and really good artwork throughout, and a lot of the just perfect, formatting and the subheadings and everything that makes this a very enjoyable, easy product to read. This one has, which is huge thumbs up, especially given how of a small scope this is. And it really, this is, the first one is for level 1, the second one level 2, third one level 3. They're very small. Each one features maybe like 3 combat encounters and a couple skill checks, and that's it. And it's just really awesome production value. There are options for playing with a DM. Obviously, the DM can, change some of the combat scenarios around, but otherwise you kind of play through the same linear adventure. And if you want to play it with a second player, or even with more players, there are additional rules included. I believe in this first adventure, those rules are included in an errata, which is a separate download included. In the future adventures, they're included just kind of at the end, like, hey, here's to make these adjustments, which is very nice. But already you can see just really, really great production value. All of the text is designed to be read like a story, like a novel, because again, we're the ones playing it, so you have to read all of this information. I really like the use of artwork here too. Yes, it's basically art that was probably like pulled off of a Google image search or something, because they're all kind of just generic environmental art, but that really works, and you're trying to sell, again, this immersive story with the person that's actually reading, which is something that usually you don't have to do because your players aren't reading the literal product. The DM that's reading the product, and they're painting the picture. In this case, not only does the text successfully, I think, paint the picture, it's very well written and very evocative, but it includes all this artwork throughout, which is really impressive and cool to see. So I think the story does a phenomenal job with the immersion factor, which is great and really elevates it. Again, it's a pretty simple idea, and it like I said, it's very short. It doesn't do a whole lot with it, but just the production value, I think, elevates that so much. So as you can see, the way it does this, and again, I'm not going to spoil too much because this is just literally like the first 2 pages and things. Obviously, it's shipwrecked. You can imagine what the inciting incident is, which is always a compelling story hook, I think. You just wake up on a beach, and then what do you do? What I was hoping it would do would be the literal, like, almost text adventure thing, and say like, hey, there's a thing over here, there's a bush over here, there's a person over here, what do you want to do, and then keep flipping the pages. That's not what this does, which is a bummer. I want to stress that is a bummer. I was really hoping we would get some more choices, some branching paths, and have more fun with it. Instead, it takes a very linear approach and has things, pop up in front of you that you have to do. It's almost like if you were playing that text adventure, but you were only going one direction the whole time, but just every screen you were in, something would pop up that you could interact with, and that involved a skill check that you had to make, and there's a very easy, success-failure thing. Initially, I was put off by the fact that, even though I think it looks good that the success and failure are right next to each other, because to me, it's like, why would you put the outcomes of the choice next to each other when you could easily see what the final, it's impossible not to cheat here. We're just looking at it and your eyes are just glancing at both. But the difference here, the reason it works is because these are skill checks and not choices. There is one instance, and I read through all 3 of them and I played through the first one. There is one instance where you do make a choice and there's no skill check involved. And at that point it does break down because one of them is very obviously bad, you're taking damage, and the other one is good, you take no damage. It's basically, do you touch a thing that could be dangerous? And it's very easy to see on there, again, just glancing at it for half a second, like, oh, well, obviously I don't want to touch the thing because I'll take damage. So at that point it breaks down. But I think that's the only instance where that happens. The rest of them are all just skill checks. So in that case, if you're making a skill check and you succeed or fail, obviously you can cheat as much as you want, but you're tied to the dice. So it's not like you're making that choice because it's a very linear adventure and the choices are already made for you. So it's just a question of making those checks. Now, a few times you have a choice within those checks. So, for example, if you successfully sneak, you might have a choice of going up, climbing up. If you have climbing equipment, which there is a cool thing in the second and third adventures where you can buy some equipment based on the loot that you got in the first one, and then if you have some of that equipment, that determines some of your successes. That's something I think the Fighting Fantasy series did. And I don't know if there's another one that did that too, but you could basically take certain equipment and that would determine what choices you could have And it does a little bit of that here, which is pretty nice. But it's just occasionally I think you're allowed to even skip a combat encounter if you play things correctly, but there's no real situation that I saw going through everything where you could really go into branching paths. That really didn't exist. Other than perhaps being able to skip maybe one encounter in each adventure, you're basically doing all of the big scenarios and situations. The main difference is if you're succeeding on these skill checks, you're getting like advantage on rolls, or you're not being surprised by enemies, or you're avoiding a trap. Whereas if you fail, then it's the bad negative version of all of that. And especially in one of them, I believe it's the second one, you could accrue several levels of exhaustion if you're really having the dice go against you. And the challenge level, the balance, is really tricky to pinpoint, because obviously D&D is not built for one player. And especially, as you can imagine, some of the classes are going to have a way more challenging time than others. If you're playing a fighter or barbarian, you can probably get through these fights unless the dice are really against you, or maybe monk or something. If you're playing a squishy spellcaster, I mean, all of it comes down to initiative. If you lose initiative, one of these enemies can run up and kill you in one hit. Or, you could lose initiative and just still have a bad show of it. Or, like I mentioned, there are several opportunities where if you fail a skill check, the enemy will surprise you. And if you lose initiative there, the enemy is going twice before you get to go, and you're pretty much toast if they can hit you. And if you fail a combat encounter, you are dead, which is something that did happen in those books that I read. You could make a bad decision, or even a decision that didn't seem bad, but you'd flip a page and it would say "the end" on the bottom, and you read the text and go, "Oh yeah, I died in some spectacular fashion." That was always a fun instance, but in here you're just playing combat and you're left to the fate of the dice, and that feels less fun because you could just be screwed by dice rolls and be like, well, I made all the right, I thought I made all the good decisions, I made my skill checks and everything, but I just lost it in the dice, and unfortunately there's just no recourse for that. So the thing I would have liked to see, obviously not every combat was just death and game over. It would have been interesting if some of the fights were, they led to a different story path, or you had a lingering injury that gave you, some kind of debilitating roll or something. But one of the problems is, some of the primary enemies you face are not the kind that would necessarily leave you left alive. So I can kind of see the problem there. But it highlights the problems of the, a dice-based combat system where you have one player, and if the dice go against you, and again, initiative means everything. Not only does initiative mean everything, but a lot of the enemies you face, especially in this level 1, again, you're level 1, you've only got 8 to 10 hit points if you're lucky, if you've got a martial class. If you lose that initiative, and these are a lot of dexterity-based enemies, then you're going to have a hard time. It's going to be very, very difficult. The text does mention at certain points where you're allowed to long rest. Obviously, you can cheat as much as you want. It's a solo adventure. But it does basically say, hey, you can short rest whenever you want, but try to only long rest when the text tells you to long rest. And in this level 1 adventure, it's very, very difficult because, first fight, I got beat up by the giant crab. I had to use a hit dice and short rest. Second fight, I got my butt kicked again, and even winning initiative on that one. And then I wanted to long rest. Thankfully, I had an item I could use. It kind of kept me going. One of the fights, I had to really cheese it. And the problem is it doesn't really allow for a lot of combat wiggle room, which you can kind of get away with in the low levels because not a lot of enemies and players have too many options. But it really doesn't expect you to think outside the box too much because there's nobody running the AI, the monsters. It says just have the monsters play to the best of their ability, which is a tricky thing to do as a player, to think for the other side. There's no Gloomhaven style AI here or anything in terms of what the enemy does and targets and how that operates. So there was one enemy that I just kind of had to if I do this, would that enemy do this? And it gets real tricky and nebulous in that case. So maybe it would have been better to have specific tactics for enemies. Instead, it just kind of says, hey, you're playing D&D by yourself. You've got to play the enemies. Just try and do it as best as you can. So, but I like the way this looks. If you look, every single combat scenario features a full page. It's got artwork of enemies. It's got a little embedded image of the battle map. It's got the stat block, and it's got some environmental text for you to look at that really paints a picture of what's going down, as well as any special notes about, hey, does this enemy surprise you, or what happens depending on what previous things happened, and then what the differences are between if you were successful or not. And like I said, all of the failures are basically game over. They do have their own text. It doesn't just say game over. It does mention there's a few fun sentences, and then it says like the end. I do appreciate that. That's kind of a nod to those old stories for sure. But I think this is about as much as I want to show, because I don't want to really spoil how things transpire, because we're the ones reading this, we're the ones experiencing it. The production values are incredibly good. I was very impressed with that. It's a bummer that it's so linear. The balance is very, very tricky to nail down. I went back and forth on whether to even fault the product for it, because that's kind of just a problem with playing solo D&D. But I think the solution would have been something along the lines of creating either slightly different combat encounters for different kinds of classes, or giving other kinds of classes a chance to have their abilities go off and change the course of combat, maybe even before combat started, as a way to balance it. For example, if you were a spellcaster, like, hey, if you want to expend a spell slot and cast some spell in this, which is kind of what the Fighting Fantasy did, because it didn't have the whole dice combat system. If you want to do this, or did Fighting, I don't know. Anyway, somebody will correct me on which one was that, but there was one where you just equip certain spells and weapons, and that just gave you the choices to make. If you have Firebolt, or if you have Thunder Wave or something, you can cast that spell, and that will end this fight. But now you've expended that spell slot, kind of a thing. That wouldn't be too bad of a way to do it. Or, for example, I played a Halfling Rogue. I just used the pre-generated one from the Wizards website, level 1, and realized, I can never sneak attack because I have no allies, and I can't ever gain advantage in these fights, because it starts you off with enemies, boom, boom. Only very few situations did I see in all 3 of them that it gave you a chance to actually surprise the enemy. More often than not, it was the enemy surprising you, which, as I mentioned, is extremely painful if that goes off. So I could almost never use one of my signature abilities. So it'd be nice if it said, like, hey, if you want to try to sneak attack this enemy, and not every time, but occasionally, like on this combat, be like, okay, now if you're a mage with these spells, you can do this, or if you're fighter or anybody else, you just have to engage the combat. Another one's like, all right, if you're a rogue with this ability, then you can do this, or if you're a ranger, then blah blah. That'd be really cool if it had more class-based choices or something involved in there. That would be some way to help balance things out a little bit, because as it is, you can probably imagine that wizards, sorcerers, you're going to have a much trickier time unless you're going to be extra liberal with yourself in terms of the long rests. It's going to be a lot trickier to get through these solo fights than it would be like a fighter, barbarian, or monk or somebody. So that is definitely an issue. I'm going to skip down real quick just so you can see what the maps look like right here. Absolutely gorgeous and amazing. This is just the first part 1. Full color gridded battle maps. The dots represent, I guess this is slightly spoilery because I should have stopped here for future battle maps. But that's so awesome. Like, that really helps the immersion factor. And I mean, if you wanted to, you could even print these out, use minis, go all for whatever you want to do, or you could just stare at that and be like, all right, I start there. And most situations and enemies and player characters, you're just pretty much going to run at each other and fight anyway. As I said, there's not a whole lot of out-of-the-box stuff you can do, and that's probably part of the advantage of it being a Tier 1 low-level adventure. There's just not a whole lot of options. It would have been nice to have a sidekick, because then that would have solved a lot of the balance issues, and maybe even let you pick your sidekick somehow, or choose their class or something, because again, so much of that balancing is because of having only one player character, and the way it balances, the way D&D does balance that, is through those sidekicks. Like, even the ones that I've reviewed that are for solo players, I believe most of them use the sidekick system. So it's disappointing not to have that here, and I think it could have been a huge advantage in the balance department for sure. I think we can go over my pros and cons then. Again, my apologies for not actually like breaking down the individual story beats or showing you more. I mean, I can flip through. This is part 2, which I will say things get more interesting and improved as you go along the adventure, which just makes sense because at level 1 there's only so much you can do, and then level 2, level 3 that just expands things out. I feel like the decisions, the few little choices you could make were a little bit more meaningful. Do you want to go up a thing or go around a thing? And that kind of can change things around a little bit. The story never gets, epic or anything, but I think they're very solid, and they have a nice pacing to it. It's a beginning, middle, and end. You feel like all of them have a good big climactic boss encounter. So I think all of that works out really well, and I just love the way it's built and constructed, and the images and the very well written text. All right, pros. short but immersive adventures. They're only, as I said, 15 to 20 pages long, each of them, but they really pull me in there, even if the actual stories aren't these big, epic, sweeping things. But if you're going to make a small, mini adventure, the storytelling is very, very good. It's very fun, and it feels like you're reading one of those choose-your-own-adventure books. Even if you're not making those choices, you're at least getting that immersion in there. And I especially love the use of images, which is something I don't see a whole lot of being used from the DM's Guild. On the one hand, yes, it's kind of like a Google image search put together. On the other hand, it works for me because I'm seeing it. It's painting the picture in my head, as well as just seeing all these images. I think builds up the theme of exploring these islands. Pros: each part of the trilogy features a complete story. This is very important to me because I have reviewed previous series. Maybe they weren't trilogies, but they were, part 1s and part 2s, and a lot of them did not feel like they were complete stories. It definitely felt like it continued on, and then I had to, read the next one. In this case, you can easily just play the first one as a quick level one shot if you wanted to and be done with it. It is more satisfying if you continue the adventure, because then you can bring your character, bring their loot, shop for some supplies, get that level up, and then continue on the adventures. It's very fun, but it's important to me that each one has a beginning, middle, and end, and they don't have any kind of cliffhanger or anything like that. So you can get complete stories, and they're sold separately on the DM's Guild, which is also important. I think they should be complete adventures. Pros: details on 2-player and DM adjustments. I do like that we have those options. If you wanted to run it with the DM, you absolutely could. Obviously, the DM can change the combat encounters around, and there are scaling notes for if you have more players, how many more enemies to add. I think that by the time you get to the third one, there are certain complications you can add to different fights and things that maybe a DM could take advantage of. So that's very cool. Obviously, they're designed as solo adventures, but they are moddable. And pro: full color grid battle maps for every single combat encounter. Huge thumbs up from me every single time. Absolutely amazing. They're included as separate player handouts, so you get the full page. The maps are really great looking. This, again, really elevates that. Having those awesome production values elevates this adventures and this trilogy so much for me. Cons: the stories are almost completely linear, which is the opposite of the Choose Your Own Adventure books, because those were literally choosing your own adventure. Even though a lot of them ended in a game over state, you were still making choices along the way, and it felt fun. This time, there are a few choices to make, but essentially they all circle back around to these combat encounters. Basically, is the whole, the main scenario. So even if they branch somewhat, they're always going to come back together into those main combat fights. So you're always fighting the same, boss at the end and that kind of thing. And that's a big bummer. I don't think replacing choices with the skill checks is narratively satisfying, even though that is in keeping with D&D. But I would have preferred to have more choices, more branching paths. That's a lot more work, and that's a more complex adventure, which is something I would love to see this designer tackle, because this is absolutely amazing production value. I would love to see this if these 3 were just one adventure, but it had multiple branching paths with maybe even A, B, to where, if you did this, made this line of choices successfully, you got to this end state, and then this line, you got to this end state. Even if it was only those 2, that would be a huge improvement over what we have now. And cons: balance issues with one-on-one combat. I think there could have been some extra steps taken, some modifications, some notes, something to allow more classes to shine that aren't necessarily going to be suited for one-on-one combat. Otherwise, a lot of these come down to, did you win the initiative roll or did you not? And is the enemy going to destroy you in one or not? Especially, there's one in the very first adventure that if that enemy wins initiative, they can do all kinds of bad things to you right off the bat. There's a good chance that, and they have a chance of surprising you. If that happens, there's a good chance you are dying right then and there, and that sucks. Final verdict: with solid storytelling built within an immersive layout, the Shipwrecked trilogy crafts short but satisfying low-level solo adventures. No DM required. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson. You can follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. Thank you.